So I've got the beautiful Natajsa Wagner here today, who is a clinical psychotherapist here in Brisbane, and she is absolutely wonderful at what you do. You are I've had a session with her, and you've got this really beautiful way of establishing compassion with yourself. And for anybody who's been to my classes before, you know that I touch on compassion a fair bit. But I feel like it still has this weird stigma attached to it where people sort of think it's just this, I don't know, hoodoo sort of guru, like that there's no solidarity to it, I suppose. Sure. And I think that, I know that there is a lot of evidence out there in the psychology world, in the scientific world, and so I really wanted to bring that to the people today.
Love it.
And I wanted to ask you first and foremost, tell us what is compassion, and how can we break that down to understand it for this day and age?
Absolutely. And I guess there's two things. So there's compassion that we feel for other people, and then self-compassion, which is what we, ideally would want to feel for ourselves. And how I define self-compassion is really being able to have empathy for our own distress. So it sounds kind of simple, right? But when we're in those moments of difficulty or challenge, how do we actually bring in that kindness and have empathy for ourselves? That's really the definition of it. It is made up of 3 components, so that's often quite helpful to kind of explain to people. So if you think about self-compassion, the 3 components are number 1, mindfulness, number 2, common humanity, and number 3, self-kindness. And I'll kind of explain each of those and what they mean so people can dig into it a bit deeper. But I guess mindfulness really is that skill or the ability to observe and tap into what you're feeling and what you're experiencing in the present moment without necessarily having to run away from it or to suppress it or deny any feelings that come up, particularly if they are difficult. And I know you talk a lot about this with yoga practice and becoming mindful of what's actually happening but not necessarily attaching or reacting to it. So that's sort of one element of self-compassion. The second element I talked about is common humanity. Now this one's not always talked about too much, but common humanity is kind of the perspective we have that when we're having a moment of difficulty or if we're having challenge, that we actually aren't alone in this. And it's kind of part of the universal human experience for all of us. Like we all experience suffering, we all experience challenge at times. And if we can remember that we're not the first to experience this and we're not the last, it can really help us not to feel alone and isolated. So when we're having those moments and we're really like giving ourselves a hard time or being like, oh my God, I can't believe I did this or this wasn't good enough, just to recognize this is really normal. It comes with the territory of being human. So it's a little perspective shift. And then the third one, self-kindness, sounds kind of self-explanatory, and it is. But it is about how do you be kind to yourselves. And I know we're going to talk a bit more about that because it sounds really simple. It's like, yes, be kind to myself. But one way I like to put it, and people may have heard of it before, is really to speak to yourself with kindness like you would someone you love, someone that you care about. And that means actually using the words, the body language, the gestures, everything that goes with that. But instead of directing that energy out, which is what we do with compassion, and we move towards someone in distress and we want to comfort them and be there for them, it's turning the energy in. So I guess that's the distinction. We know how to do it really well with others, but turning that in, and I guess we'll talk more about those practices as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So can you explain a little bit more about why it is so important?
Yes. Absolutely. I think compassion, I say it's like a secret superpower. And it's important because it's like anything that we learn, particularly compassion, self-compassion is an internal resource. So it's something that you can draw on anytime you need to. So it's really helpful. So if you're going through a challenge, if you're feeling like something you've done is a failure, and I say failure because I don't believe there's any failures, just opportunities for growth and to improve. But if you're in one of those states or something's happened and you're giving yourself a really hard time, you've got a resource that you can actually draw on straight away. And there's also a lot of benefits to self-compassion. I see it really as a preventative too. So if we can kind of nip things in the bud, that negative self-talk, it stops us from spiraling into not feeling worthy, depression, anxiety, rumination, all all of those things. And we know that the research on self-compassion, so there's a lot of research, even applying self-compassion with trauma and PTSD, is actually showing us, number one, it is an internal resource. Number two, it builds our emotional resilience. And that's really important because not only does it mean like you can respond to situations and actually move through challenges, but every time you do, you get better at it and you bounce back faster, you know? So it's huge for that. It makes us feel happier, more autonomous. Who doesn't want that? There's less stress, anxiety, and depression from this as well. The research shows us it lowers that when we can apply self-compassion to ourselves. There's also, I think, some really great benefits. So I actually had another little one I wrote. It lowers worry and rumination, which I think is huge, right? So for that overthinking mind, the anxiety, we're actually going to not just stop the worry, but the rumination where we go over and over and over it. And sometimes that's like the cycle we get caught in. So self-compassion is really great to support us in that way as well.
Absolutely.
I
think we can, it's huge, right? And I'm sure there's so many things, there's so many points there that, you know, I listen to and I'm like, 100%. Like, who doesn't feel that? I know I definitely feel that, and that rumination. And it's good to have that buffer, but it's how do we actually put that into action? Like, can you share that?
So what are the actual practices? And I think it's a really important point. So if I use those three elements, I'll tell you, I guess, how I implement it into my life. And I've done a little mini course on compassion I can share with anyone who's watching this if they're interested in doing it. But to give you a very brief overview, if we think about that mindfulness, so how could we actually practice mindfulness when it comes to self-compassion? And for me, the number one way is meditation. And I know you're such a fan of meditation as well and using it to connect. I use a compassion meditation, which also looks at, you know, when someone might have been not the nicest to us, or we're struggling with the behaviour, or, you know, we're struggling with being compassionate. I use a compassion meditation that I've recorded that touches on that, but also brings mindfulness to, well, how do we be compassionate to ourselves when maybe we display some of the same behaviour, or just self-compassionate in general. So definitely a practice of meditation is a great way to start when you're learning about self-compassion and being aware. The second bit is that perspective shift. And for some people, it will be enough just to actually acknowledge common humanity. So that's the second bit, to actually go, this is a difficult moment, I'm feeling challenged, and other people go through this, I'm not alone. And the reason that's really important in actually expressing that it is difficult is we know that the neuroscience research shows us that when we can name emotions, when we can talk about them, bring them forward, it actually lowers anxiety and we get a bit of relief for it. So actually in the moment when we're feeling challenged, when things are difficult, just acknowledging it and going, you know, this is really hard and I'm not alone. Like everyone else, honestly, everyone else at some point has felt what you're feeling. You are not the first and the last. So sometimes it's just that simple perspective shift. Sometimes you might be resistant to self-compassion. And that's where I say, okay, you know, come along and work with, whether it's a therapist, a coach, an educator, you know, a yoga practice, a beautiful teacher to help you tap into that and really identify the resistance. So sometimes there's that. And then the third thing I would say when it comes to self-kindness and how we can do that practice, and I know it sounds really simple, but for me, I combine kind words with supportive touch. So it's not enough just to probably think the words. I often like to verbalize them as well and say words that are really supportive. But what you can do to really, I guess, turn the switch of kindness on, because that's what you're asking, like, how do we turn this on? How do we do this self-kindness? So if you get your hand even and place it on your heart, we know that when we place anything on our body and we draw attention to it, we start to focus on it. And we kind of signal that, okay, we're going to drop into that mind-heart connection, because there is a connection. We even change the physiology, and, you know, we've spoken about breath, how we start to relax the nervous system, and we go into that state of I'm safe. And then once we combine that with just some really beautiful, supportive words to ourselves, you know, what you'd say to a friend, like, you know, it's okay. Like, you're absolutely enough. You're beautiful, you're safe, you're loved. Any words that feel right for you. And as you do that, and if it helps, you can close your eyes, you can connect in with it, or you can just do it, you know, in your mind if you're kind of on the bus and you can't.
Fair enough.
really do it on your way to work, but you really need to. Just being able to internally say that, bring the supportive touch in, it can really shift things. And obviously it's a practice. It really feels awkward sometimes for people when they start this because they're like, what is this? But self-compassion is like a muscle. So it's really the more we use it, the more we practice, the easier it becomes. But that's what I'd say, each of the elements, if you break it down, that's something you can do. And just really quickly to bring them all together, how we can use that, I say, is called a self-compassion break, which is actually combining all three. So it's say there's a difficult moment, you're giving yourself a really hard time and you're going, I can't believe I did, this presentation at work and it was terrible and, I just wasn't prepared and I just didn't do a good job. So first thing, get mindful, name it, okay? This is a moment of difficulty and challenge and I'm struggling with it, just naming it, bringing that mindfulness in, then bring the common humanity in, right? I'm not the only one that this has happened to, and everyone goes through this at some point. And then the kind words, it's actually okay. And, in this moment of distress, may I be helpful to myself, not harmful. So you can create your own kind of script just using those three elements, but it's just something quick you can do, and it's called a self-compassion break. So, give yourself take 5.
I could feel that just then as you were saying it, like you can, I definitely felt that within, and that's touch, that anchoring in and actually feeling physically, obviously we try to do that in yoga, but when we don't have the time to do the practice, just having that self-compassion moment, that self-compassion break, and tapping into that, it's so beautiful, so powerful, and I am so grateful that you shared that with us today. Definitely loads of information there, and if that hasn't convinced you, I don't know what will. But definitely, if you want to go and see Natajsa out at Ashgrove here in Brisbane, I highly recommend. I'm going to link below all your details and a link to that self-compassion course as well. I think that would be...
And I have a meditation that I can share just for free for anyone who might want to tune into that compassion meditation.
That sounds awesome. I might grab that off you too. Thank you so much.
Cheers.